Welcome, everyone, and thank you for the warm reception. Just so you know, it's allergy season for me right now, so bear with me. I'll probably be taking a sip of water every now and then. So, is that better? Okay. I'll be taking a sip of water when I need to because of my allergies. But welcome. My talk tonight is divided into two parts. First, I'm going to retell the story of the two cannons that sit on the Barnstable County Courthouse lawn and discuss how they came to be. I'm going to talk about it in terms of the larger historical picture that was going on at the time in 1814 in the world and in the United States and also on Cape Cod. I think it's important to have the larger context to get a full appreciation of these artifacts that we have on the courthouse lawn. And then I'm going to switch gears and I'm going to talk about the cannons as artifacts, specifically a little-known mystery about these cannons. It was unknown to me until I discovered it, and I don't think a lot of people realize this. At least I've never heard anybody talk about this mystery about them. So I'll bring that to light when we switch over into the second part of the discussion. But I first want to set the stage for their origin. So let's go ahead and begin. As people know, in the village of Barnstable, two ancient cannons sit on the county courthouse lawn. They're sort of symbolically protecting the villagers from their old seafaring adversaries, I'd like to say. Though if they were fired today, they'd probably take off the roof of Jim and Jenny's roof of their house across the street. So they haven't been fired in a long time. They were fired for a while during 4th of July celebrations after the war, but they were never actually fired during the war. There were originally 4 cannon, not 2, and they were obtained in 1814 during the War of 1812. However, 2 of them were unfortunately melted down and born for the Great War effort. They needed metal for the Great War, and so 2 of them were lost at that time. So we only have 2 remaining. And so let's talk about how they got on the courthouse lawn in the first place. And really, to answer that question, you need to look at the big picture, as I said, and I try to sort of reduce it down to one person. Who's the one person responsible for why they're there in the first place? In my mind, when I read about it and tried to understand it, I came across this guy, Napoleon. If you think about it, right? So Napoleon was basically making a real troublemaker in Europe at the time during the Napoleonic Wars. The Napoleonic Wars lasted from 1803 to 1815, and he was basically just, pretty much trying to rule into all of Europe. His adversaries included Britain, obviously, the Russian Empire, Sweden, and Spain kind of went back and forth. Sometimes they were friends with Napoleon, sometimes they weren't. But the real adversary was really between Britain and France, for the most part. Napoleon really had a desire to invade England, cross the English Channel, and take out the monarchy and replace it with his understanding of how England should be run. So there was a very hot hostility between England and France. You can think about those wars, if you remember Admiral Nelson and the Battle of Trafalgar, that's all happening at that time, where Nelson destroys the French fleet and he becomes a hero. But that's earlier, and that's 1805 or so. And 1812, when we're talking about 1814, basically the U.S. is trying to stay out of this conflict. They don't want to pick a side. They want to trade with both France and Britain. And Britain and France both don't like that. They want us to side with them. Again, we try to stay neutral. Britain was especially hostile to the U.S. in our neutrality. What they were doing basically between that time frame was capturing our merchant sailors and sometimes our naval sailors and impressing them into the Royal Navy. 15,000 sailors were victims of this policy over the years. So they were very hostile to the U.S., even though we were trying to stay neutral. And basically, by 1812, President Madison, a Southerner from Virginia, had enough and decided to declare war on England. And decided that enough was enough. And to the dismay of the New Englanders, who did not want to go to war at the time, because they knew what it would mean for them. It would be tremendous financial hardship, because most New Englanders, and especially people on the Cape, did most of their business on the sea. And it meant that there was going to be a naval blockade up and down the Atlantic coast. And that is, in fact, what happened during this war. You can see this naval blockade, how far it went. It went up from Maine all the way down to Louisiana. And Cape Cod was especially hit hard during this naval blockade. The New Englanders referred to this war in a derogatory term. They called it Mr. Madison's War. They wanted no part of it, but they were dragged into it. So they had to deal with it, and the British too. So there's a naval blockade. Cape Cod is suffering financially, and the British are really, putting the screws to the people on the Cape Cod at the time. There were three sort of areas of activity on the Cape where the British were focusing. On the southern part of the Cape, near Falmouth, and over by Wareham. Basically, there were ships down there that were putting a blockade in. There was the HMS Nimrod. Perhaps some of you have heard of that. They patrolled the southern waters off of Falmouth and Buzzards Bay, and the Nimrod captured or destroyed over 50 ships. On the Upper Cape in Plymouth area, the HMS Nymph and the HMS Bulwark was patrolling the waters. And then on the bay side, where we are, Captain Richard Raggett of the HMS Spencer, who was considered the terror of the bay, was harassing Eastham, Brewster, Barnstable, Sandwich, and extorting money or attempting to extort money from these towns in response for protection. He basically was sending his sailors in and say, give us X amount of money or we'll bomb your towns, right? They did it in Falmouth too. And some of the Cape towns resisted and some of them acquiesced. Falmouth was one of those towns that resisted, and because of that, they suffered severe consequences. They refused to pay or comply to the HMS Nimrod's captain, and they were bombarded. And they had over 300 cannonballs attacked. They were attacked with over 300 cannonballs from the HMS Nimrod on January of 1814. And there's a wonderful painting in Falmouth that you can see in the town hall. This is a painting depicting that event in January. On January 28, 1814. You've got the Falmouth militia firing back and the British firing into the town. It's an interesting story to hear about it, some of the details of it, and I'm going to relay some of them to you. Falmouth stood firm against the British. Hostilities basically erupted when the captain of the Nimrod heard that there was a U.S. sloop that ran aground off of Woods Hole, so he sent some sailors in small boats to attack the vessel. However, the Falmouth Artillery Company got wind of this attack and hastened to Woods Hole. They arrived in time and fired on the British, killing one sailor and wounding another. When the Nimrod captain learned of this failed attack, he wanted revenge. He sailed the Nimrod to Falmouth, raised a white flag, and sent a boat ashore. When the landing party came onto the wharf, it demanded that Falmouth turn over the 2 cannons they had and also hand over the sloop. And the artillery company commander responded. His name was Weston Jenkins, and he supposedly replied with the following words. He said, "If you want the cannon, come and get them, and we'll give you what's inside them first." So the British replied that the Nimrod would bomb Falmouth in an hour. And that's, in fact, what they did. But they had time to evacuate the women and children from the town. And one woman stayed behind, Weston Jenkins' wife, who cooked meals for the artillery and the soldiers that were defending the town. And the British bombarded and basically hurled about 300 cannonballs into the town, causing a fair amount of damage. One particular fun story about this is that one of the damaged buildings for many years was the Nimrod restaurant, named after the ship. It was a hole in the building made by a cannonball in its men's room. And the owners of the Nimrod used to, promote that story. The building has since been torn down, I've learned. It's no longer an artifact for you to see there. So Falmouth had it rough. And let's talk about some other Cape towns that also had to deal with this problem. Again, on the bay side, the Cape Towns were also threatened. As previously mentioned, Raggett and the HMS Spencer threatened Eastham, Brewster, and Orleans with bombardment unless they paid ransom. Orleans resisted, and Eastham and Brewster paid. I think Brewster paid about $4,000, and Eastham paid about $1,200. This news clipping that you see here tells the story of how the original ransom letter sent to Brewster from Richard Raggett was found and is now preserved in the town of Brewster. I was trying to figure that out. I don't remember the date on it, unfortunately. I wish I could do, but I could probably... I'm not sure the date that the letter was found. That came out of the Barnstable Patriot, so I could probably look it up and find that for you. Interestingly, the funny story about this, during the bicentennial, the selectmen of Brewster petitioned the British government for their $4,000 back, plus interest. But the British refused. And the British basically said, do you have a receipt from Captain Raggett? Because we need a receipt. That's a joke. So, but they didn't get their money back, but they did pay $4,000 for peace. So let's turn to the Barnstable cannons now, closer. Again, the story of the Barnstable cannons, which I'm going to relay here, is inscribed actually on one of the cannons. That plaque was put on by our family in the 1990s to sort of describe why they're there in the first place. And here's basically a summary of the story. So after the bombardment of Falmouth in January of that year, the village of Barnstable was also placed in the position of having to either pay extortion money or have their town bombarded. And specifically, Richard Raggett specifically threatened the salt works that resided on the shoreline of Barnstable Village, which were owned by Loring Crocker. He had basically about 17,000 feet of running salt works at its height, probably in the 1830s, but it was significant salt works in 1814. And basically, the town was told that they needed to pay $6,000 or the salt works would be bombarded. That isn't the equivalent of about $91,000 today if you take $1814 and convert them to today, so about $91,000. So the town had to make a decision, pay or suffer the consequences. And again, as I was saying, in the early 19th century, Cape Cod had a vast teeming saltworks industry all over the Cape. It wasn't just in Barnstable. There were about 600 private salt-making businesses at its peak. Loring Crocker Saltworks happened to be one of the larger ones. And salt was very key to the fishing economy. There was no refrigeration back then, so you used salt to preserve your fish. So it was key to the economy back then. This photo is actually a mid-19th century photo depicting Loring Crocker Saltworks, so a little later after the conflict, but it's looking north from Raspin Creek towards the bay. And today you would see Commerce Road where the salt works sort of begins. So it's quite a large industry and quite exposed to the water because it was right on the water. You needed to be there to get your ocean salt to make the ocean water to make the salt. So the town of Barnstable, it's interesting, we have the town records at the time, and when they debated whether to pay or not, they recorded the following statement, which is rather brave of them. Basically, the town meeting stated the following: in times of danger, it is the duty of every citizen to rally round the standards of his country and resist such invasion and depredations with all the means of his power. The choice was between honorable resistance or base submission, and decided a line must be drawn in the sand. So Barnstable decided that they were not going to pay the money that Raggett was expecting from them. The town leaders petitioned the state of Massachusetts to provide military support to counter the impending threat. After the petition, it is believed that Loring and the town's Committee of Safety traveled to Boston and procured the 4 cannons that I mentioned and ordnance and brought them back on ox cart to Barnstable. They couldn't go by sea, obviously, because of the blockade. They brought them back by land. And they mounted them, 2 at Blish Point, over here on the right, and 2 at Salton Point. Now, the 2 at Blish Point would be guarding the salt works because the salt works was located over here, but they also wanted to guard Salton Point too. Basically guarding the mouth of the harbor right here. two on two on each side. And according to tradition, a guard was also stationed near these guns day and night if warships appeared at the harbor mouth. Another guard stationed in the belfry of the old church on Cobb's Hill was to ring the church bell and thus call the militiamen to arms. So, shortly after their placement, Captain Raggett decided to leave the village alone. Villagers have debated how much the 4 cannons contributed to the town's safety, given that they were not very large, they're 3 or 4 pounders, and certainly no match to the HMS Spencer's 74-gun third-rate ship of the line. We're fortunate to have a painting of the HMS Spencer. This painting depicts combat with the French in 1801. Now, the HMS Spencer contained 28 32-pound guns, 30 18-pound guns, 12 9-pounders, and 4 9-pounders. It was a very formidable ship. Putting this ship against, 4 cannons that are 3 or 4 pounders, there'd really be no match. But the captain of the Spencer did leave Barnstable alone. And some have argued that it was probably the dangerous shifting sandbars in the Barnstable harbor. The captain would not want to bring a ship of this magnitude into the harbor only to get stuck with the tides and the sandbar, and then it would be a sitting duck if that were to happen. So he decided that there were other better, easier targets than Barnstable. So that's basically the story behind them, and why we have them commemorated there on the courthouse lawn. Again, I mentioned that we lost 2 in World War I to provide support. Maybe that medal went back to Germany or something as artillery. In 1921, the cannons were placed on the courthouse lawn. So that's and they were placed, interestingly, you'll see that they were placed in these concrete casings. That's not how they existed when they were on Blish Point and Salton Point. They were probably likely on wooden, wheels like you would think of a cannon today. These were designed specifically for the courthouse lawn here, so don't confuse the actual cannons and the casings as part of the same thing. Anyways, those are the 2 cannons that we have there, and now what I want to do is switch gears and talk specifically about these 2 interesting cannon artifacts, about what I discovered about them that, again, I don't think many people know about. The interesting thing that I discovered when I looked at them closer is that they appear to be British. They're not American cannons. And the way I know this, or the way I believe I know this, is when you look closely, you'll see that there's a faint but unmistakable crown right there, stamped on the top of their barrels near the cannon's breech. The breech is the rear part of the cannon. The crown appears to be similar in appearance to crown markings on other British cannons of the time. If true, it would be a bit of historic irony for the villagers to use British artillery to defend their town against the British Royal Navy during the War of 1812. It's kind of neat, actually. And as you can see in this photo, there's also a faint but unmistakable H or M or C stamped here. I really can't decipher it right now, but there's some lettering there also. So, but and let me give you context here. Here is an actual British cipher used during the reign of King George III on cannons by the British, and you can see the remarkable similarities with the cannon, with the crown there, ours and theirs, right? They have the motto of King George stamped in there too. So this British origin started to intrigue me. It sort of planted a seed in my head to try to figure out, where do they come from, right? We know they supposedly came from Boston, but did they have a life before Boston? If so, what was it? So I wanted to find out more. And if they were in fact British, did they harken back to the Revolutionary War, or even earlier, maybe the French and Indian War? Again, where did they come from? Were they seized from a wrecked British ship? Did they come from a fort like Fort Ticonderoga? Or were they field artillery? Maybe they were captured during a retreating British army, and the Americans captured these cannons when the British were retreating. I don't know. My imagination kind of went wild, though, trying to figure out where they possibly could have come from. So to get answers, I realized I'd have to talk to some experts because I'm not a cannon expert. I don't know anything about, or very little about, cannons, except what I saw in Hollywood movies, That was pretty much about it. So I started to do some reading on the internet and sort of figure things out. I took measurements of our cannons and tried to get photos of them and try to understand them better. Some of the key aspects of our cannons that are worth mentioning is that they're cast iron. They have a length of about 48 inches. When you measure a cannon, you don't include the very end of it, the cascable, just the main barrel area. That's got a 48-inch barrel. And then the muzzle bore, the diameter of the muzzle bore is 3 5/8 inches. So that roughly translates into what's called a 3 or 4 pounder cannon. So relatively small because, again, cannon pounders, they go up to the 40 size pounds. So those key pieces would help me in sort of figuring this out, or trying to figure this out. Again, here are the details that I sort of captured here. I also learned some things about cannons that are also helpful to know. There's some key terms that are worth sort of understanding, so you're better informed when you talk about them. There's the muzzle of the cannon you can see right there. That's where the cannonball comes out. The mouth of it, that's often. On the rear is the breech. That's actually where the cannon explosion happens, where the cannonball resides until the gunpowder is exploded out of the bore. Right there is the bore. This is the cascable. I talked to you about that. That's often used to secure the cannon or move it. You could put some rope around it, tie it down, especially if it's on a ship. Or if you want to move it, you can use it with rope. And then these are called the trunnions. They're sort of in the middle of it. They help you move the cannon up and down. And trunnions can actually give you clues also to a cannon's origin. So some of the key terms worth understanding. There's other terms in here, but we're not going to go into the details there. I mentioned the trunnions. The trunnions are interesting because they often provide clues to a cannon's origins. They often have the foundry stamp on the trunnions. And I want to show you an example, a very nearby example. So if we jump over to Harwich, Harwich has an 1815 era cannon there. And it's located in Brooks Park in Harwich. It's larger than the Barnstable cannon. It looks like it's about a 6-pounder. There's no British cipher mark on the cannon's breech like we have, but there is a letter B foundry mark stamped on the trunnion. See the trunnion right there? B. So the foundry put that there. Our Barnstable cannons don't have, as far as I can tell, any foundry stamp on the trunnions. They're partially obscured by those concrete casings, but I haven't been able to see anything there. So we don't have a clue in terms of a foundry stamp on ours. But that's a good example of how the trunnions were used for identification. Okay, so let's go back to our Barnstable Village cannons and talk some more about possible origins, right? So I was thinking, all right, they came from Boston, they're British. Maybe they came from Fort Ticonderoga. Villages have talked about this as a potential possibility. Fort Ticonderoga was a fort, or is a fort in upstate New York. It was captured by the Americans, Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys, very early in the American Revolution. We kicked the British out. It was full of British cannons. They're called, the name escapes me at the moment, but there were many cannons there. And what happened was, during the siege of Boston by the British, Colonel Henry Knox went to Fort Ticonderoga and procured 60 of these cannon and brought them back to Boston in the winter on sleds from upstate New York to Boston. The Mass Pike wasn't built yet, so he couldn't use that, which was a very heroic effort. And they brought them to Boston, and it actually was key to ending the siege in Boston by the British. The British were eventually forced to leave. So I'm thinking, could they possibly have come from Fort Ticonderoga? So the first thing I want to do is try to determine or either rule it out or see if it was possible. Fortunately, Henry Knox created an inventory of the cannons he took. Here's his inventory right here. Okay, we know the sizes and the types, whether they're cast iron or howitzer or they're mortar or they're brass. Unfortunately, there's no 3 or 4 pounder cast iron cannon on his list. So that pretty much rules out that possibility. They weren't likely from Henry Knox's inventory of cannons that he bought from Boston. But I wanted to sort of determine whether that was a possibility. All right, so they're likely not Henry Knox cannons. However, maybe, my mind's going still, maybe they came off of a British warship. If you recall your Revolutionary War history, the HMS Somerset was a very large third-rate ship of the line that ran aground in Provincetown in 1778. Massive ship, filled with cannons. And basically, when it ran aground, the crew was stranded there. 400 sailors were taken prisoner and marched from Provincetown to Boston. And Paul Revere afterwards took the 70 cannon from the ship, brought them to Boston, and settled them at Castle Island in Boston. All right? So maybe one of our cannons is from there. That's what I was thinking. So again, we have the inventory of cannons that were taken. And unfortunately, again, there were no 3 or 4 pounder cannons made of cast iron. So rules that out. Strike 2. So my hopes were getting a little dashed. So I realized, all right, I'm going to have to do more research to sort of figure this out if I'm ever going to figure this out. So I had to understand some more about cannons before I could sort of get away from the sort of needle in a haystack kind of approach. Things worth mentioning some more about cannons. I mentioned ours are cast iron. Cannons back then were typically made of either cast iron bronze, which is copper and tin, or brass, which is an amalgam of copper and zinc. Bronze and brass did not rust, unlike cast iron, which had to be painted or protected to prevent oxidation, especially on a ship with sea salt. Bronze was more expensive than cast iron. It was heavier and wore out sooner, but could be melted down again and reused, while cast iron could not. Once you expended the life of a cast iron cannon, you had to throw it out. It was useless after that. Cast iron cannons, interestingly, could burst upon firing at any time, which made them much more dangerous. So keep that fact in mind in a second, because ours are cast iron. Put that thought away for a second. Again, I mentioned I'm from the D.C. area. Every spring at Mount Vernon in Virginia, George Washington's home, they have a reenactment there, which is fun to watch. It's field artillery between the British and the American reenactors. This cannon is I believe it's a 3-pound brass grasshopper cannon. It's kind of fun to look at. These are not Continental troops. You would think they were because they're blue. They're actually German Hessian troops. So the Hessian Germans fought alongside, were paid by the British to do their fighting with them in America because they didn't have enough troops of their own. I have to imagine that their blue uniforms caused some confusion on the battlefield with the Continental Army. Had a fun conversation with these guys. They told me about the fact that cast iron cannons could explode, and they told me an interesting story about them. So, interestingly, President John Tyler was almost killed by an exploding cannon, a cast iron cannon, in 1844 while on board the USS Princeton on the Potomac River. He was observing a firing demonstration, and one of the cannons exploded, well, a very large cannon. Others were not as fortunate as Tyler, and he died in the event. Not Tyler, but others died in the event. Specifically, the Secretary of the Navy was killed in this event. And this painting, illustration, depicts this unfortunate incident. President Tyler was spared, but I mentioned 6 others were killed. So because of this proclivity to explode without notice, cast iron cannons especially, but also all cannons, they had to be stress tested with their capacity, what they call proved, before they were accepted into service. So most cannons would have a proof stamp marked on the cannon's breech, basically certifying that the cannons could work for the caliber of cannonball that you were intended to use and to fire on it. And so the foundry was basically putting their stamp of approval on that to say that they were safe for the ordnance that they were going to be designed to be used for. So that proof mark is an interesting thing to consider in this story. All right, so back to my sort of quest to figure this out again. So again, through my research, I learned that much can be determined about cannons based on their dimensions and shape. For instance, the Royal Navy had very specific size and weight specifications for the cannons they procured and used on their ships. This table here basically shows the standard artillery barrel length of guns for each shot weight listed in the British Royal Navy's Establishment of 1764. That's what they refer to this as, the Establishment of 1764. So where you see colors in this grid is where they would have cannon sizes for the respective shot weight. So for a 6-pound cannon, they would have 6, 6.5, 7, 8, 9 in terms of the length of the gun. So you can see whether or not our cannons fit into this grid or not. And unfortunately, they don't. Again, they're 3 or 4 pounders and they're only 48 inches in length. The British Navy didn't have those on their ships, at least officially. They might have had them unofficially, at least not officially. So, with our 48-inch length and a 3 to 4 pound shot weight, they don't align with this table. So I'm learning things, but I'm learning negatively. It's like Thomas Edison when he tried to figure out the light bulb, right? He tried a million different filaments till he finally found one that worked. I'm ruling things out. So we've ruled out Fort Ticonderoga. We've ruled out British Royal Navy cannons likely. We ruled out, them coming from the HMS Somerset. So I'm really sort of scratching my head going, what can I do? So I finally decided that I had to call in some help. I needed to call in the big guns, so to speak. So to do that, I emailed, 2 slides too fast, did I? Oh no, right there. I emailed the Curator of Artillery for the Royal Armouries Museum in Leeds, England. Possibly the best source of information on 18th century British artillery, should you ever find yourself in this position. It's kind of a once-in-a-lifetime event. It's the UK's National Museum of Arms and Armour, and it contains one of the largest collections of arms and armour in the world. And so I sent an email to the curator, and I explained the story of our cannons, provided their measurements and some photos, and asked for help in identifying their possible origin. I honestly didn't expect a response, given their prestige and our small, obscure story here. So I hit send and thought, I'll get an email back right, I'll probably never see it again. But surprisingly, I got a rather quick response from the Curator of Artillery, Mr. Philip A. McGrath. And he sent me a rather cordial and informative letter, which I was just charmed by. These are some excerpts from this letter. I want to read it to you, the pieces that I've outlined here. It says, "Thank you for your interesting inquiry. Based on the information you have provided, I would say that the guns are short 3-pounders, but seemingly not those that would have been used by the Navy of this period. The inscriptions are very faint, and I may be mistaken, but the visible crown looks to me like a proofing stamp that we used on guns cast for the defense of the merchant fleet. These would be stamped with the Board of Ordnance broad arrow and additionally with the royal cipher on that part of the barrel known as the chase. My speedy and limited research shows me that the HMS Spencer was a third-rate ship of the line constructed in 1800, armed with 74 guns and described by Adrian Curana as the main strength of the British battle fleet. The largest naval vessel that I can find housing 3-pounders at this time was a 32-gun. So, if I am correct, it does beg the question, where did these guns really come from? This is, of course, difficult to say without recourse to any written record. It is a shame that no further inscriptions are legible. This is, in fact, characteristic of guns built for the merchant fleet. Very plain, with little or no inscription other than that of the manufacturer, which was usually stamped on the trunnions, which are sadly hidden by the concrete. It is with incredibly brave action on the part of the locals with the guns of this size. The Georgian Navy was not a force to be trifled with." So we got a compliment from the Brits on our defense. So basically to summarize, based on his analysis, which I have no reason to question, it appears that these cannons were likely cannons used on British merchant ships to protect their crew and cargo from predators, like pirates and privateers, or maybe even another hostile nation. If these were merchant cannons, this begs the question, which merchant ship did they come from? That would be a fun mystery to solve. So, more to come on this. That concludes my talk. So. I'll turn it over to questions if people have. If someone asks me a lot about cannons and artillery, I know we have an expert in the crowd. So I might have to refer to Dan Cullity, who's in the crowd, who can help too on some questions. So what I want to do is take your questions. I'm going to repeat your question in the microphone so all can hear it, and then I'll try to respond accordingly. So if someone has a question, raise your hand. Way in the back.
Where did the cannons reside between 1814 and when they got on the courthouse lawn?
So the question is, where did they reside between 1814 and 1821, right, that big gap? That's actually a fun story. I'll try to sort of paraphrase my understanding of it, and my father may even know more. Basically, the cannons were sort of taken over by the villagers. They were often fired during 4th of July celebrations until somebody got hurt. I think someone was killed. Again, 2 were melted down and born during World War I. But one ended up buried in Hyannis, I believe, for some time. And another one ended up in my great-grandfather's garage, which is the house on the corner of Millway and 6A. And it was my great-grandfather who dug the cannon out of his garage and found the one that was buried and then presented them to the village. And then the village decided as the town to commemorate them and install them on the courthouse lawn. So, question?
Do you know, did the British actually fire a parting shot before they left Barnstable? Did they take a shot at the town?
The question is, did the British actually fire a parting shot before they left town? First of all, we don't know for sure whether Captain Raggard entered into the Barnstable Harbor area or not. So without that knowledge, we probably wouldn't know whether that happened or not. There's no record that I've been able to find. Anybody else with a question? Go ahead.
Well, I'm representing the opposition here. How did the towns that paid the Navy not to bombard them, how did they make the payment? And what did they pay in gold and in currency? They're not going to give them dollars so they can go down to Atlantic City and the casinos.
Yeah, so the question is for the towns that paid, Brewster and Eastham, how did they cough up the money and what form of money is? I actually don't know. I think I've heard some stories where Orleans might have requested money from other towns, or I don't know, honestly. But that would be a fun story to figure out. You know what is also interesting, which I think what I would like to, as a project for me when I retire, all of the towns on the Cape know their story about the War of 1812 and their role in it. You can go to Sandwich and hear great stories. You can go to Orleans, Brewster, or Falmouth. No one, to my knowledge, has put together a comprehensive history of Cape Cod and the War of 1812. And I think that would be a fun book to write. And I would include Wareham, and I would include Plymouth, this area, because they were very much a part of it also. So, wish I could answer your question. Anybody else? Way in the back.
Another question concerning the British impressment. In defense of the British, during or prior to the War of 1812, the Americans were offering a great deal more benefits and more money, so a lot of the British seamen did jump ship into the American ships. And the other comment is that Britain, even at that time, considered our colonists to still be citizens of Britain.
Thank you.
So they had their own excuse.
Did everybody hear that? Yeah. Thank you.
Any more questions? Oh, go right ahead.
Yarmouth Port was a very important port at that time, right? I mean, that's from everything that I've read. And so you didn't mention Yarmouth Port at all in terms of British interaction with them. Do you know anything about that? Or is it the same as Barnstable?
Yeah, so the question is about Yarmouth Port, and there was, to your point, British and Yarmouth interaction during the war there. I don't know the details. I can probably find some stuff for you if that interests you. But yeah, they were also involved in the War of 1812. Anybody else?
The previous story that I had read said that the cannons likely came from Fort Ticonderoga. So I assume that came from somebody in your family or somebody in the town had put out that story before.
Yeah.
So you're rejecting that story.
Yeah, so he's asking if I'm rejecting the Ticonderoga origin. I can't find any evidence to support it. So I'd love to, but I haven't been able to. Any other questions?
I have a point of interest, perhaps, and this is to me. Man Jack Percival was born here in West Barnstable in 1809. At age 13, he went into the merchant, he was a merchant. And it says here on Wikipedia, he was impressed by the Royal Navy. He was first sent to the HMS Victory under Lord Jarvis, or Jervis, I think it's Jarvis. And then he soon received an assignment to be on a prize cruise, which was captured by a Spanish merchantman. So that all correlates to what we're talking about here, with the seamen being impressed in the service of the Royal Navy, whether it's there or not.
Any more questions or comments to contribute? Well, thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it.
For shame ye take no care, me boys, how stands the glass around? Let mirth and wine abound, the trumpets sound, the colours they are flying, boys, to fight, kill or wound. May we still be found, content with our heart fare, me boys, on the cold, cold ground.